Vidushi.
And we're back to talk to you about whiteness again.
Hello. So, I want to talk to you today, Amy, about white privilege.
Okay.
So I've had a lot of friends, and they're working to be anti-racist, and they often find themselves trapped in this cycle of guilt and shame, and it seems to be connected to this language of white privilege. So I was just wondering, where did this idea come from?
As far as I know, the idea of white privilege came around in Peggy McIntosh's 1989 article, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack. And in that article, she talks about this idea that white people are walking around with this, backpack of privileges that, that we're just not aware of. We can go into a store, not get followed around. We can buy makeup or Band-Aids that match our skin, and we just kind of take this for granted. We can buy cards for family members with people on them that look like us. We can cash a check, and we rarely get questioned for it. Or we can, drive without getting pulled over by the police, for example. So she lists a number of these kinds of things, and that's what she calls white privilege.
Why do you think people are so gung-ho about this concept?
So I think people, use this concept because they think it's going to be a way to build white people's empathy for the experiences of people of color. So if white people are aware that, that their experiences don't match those of people of color, they'll, if they're, aware of their increased advantages relative to those of people of color, that maybe they will begin to understand or be aware of and feel better or feel more understanding for the plight of people of color. I think it has really good intentions.
Okay.
So there's this privilege walk activity that a lot of instructors use that is supposed to illustrate the concept of white privilege, although it actually illustrates multiple kinds of privilege. And it's an icebreaker for thinking about whiteness initially. And so what instructors have students do is have them line up in like a straight line, and then they ask them a series of questions about their lives. And so, for example, they'll ask them if their parents went to college, and if their parents went to college, then the students step forward a step. Were you on free lunches? And if you were on free lunches, then you, like when you were in school, then you step back a step. And eventually the students are separated out so that the most privileged students are at the front of the line and the least privileged students are at the back. So what ends up happening then is that you have this very visible illustration of which students in the class were privileged and which ones weren't. There's not really any huge takeaway from this other than to give this like kind of a new name or framework called white privilege. And there's nothing really to do with it. It's not clear to me that this activity has any actual teaching advantage, any actual advantage for the students, any takeaways. Mm-hmm. And I think it actually could be really disadvantageous for students, really harmful. But it's really popular. Teachers think it's an easy way for students to think about white privilege. All it does is create visibility. Mm-hmm. And then,
which is important, right? Because historically, whiteness is pretty invisible.
Yeah, right? So I think that is the idea,
yeah.
Is to get people thinking about white privilege. But it's kind of okay, now we know, and then...
White privilege is kind of this concept that's hitting the snooze button on the alarm of racism, but it just still exists. We know it still exists, and it just lets us sleep. Or lets people sleep, because it doesn't give anybody anything to do about it.
Right. But I think it provides an easy explanation for what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, and like you were saying earlier, I think it's well-intentioned, but people use it so much and in so many ways that doesn't have a clear meaning, and therefore it doesn't seem very helpful, and definitely not the most helpful way to approach problems of race and whiteness, because when you frame it as white privilege, maybe it even becomes something that people don't even want to give up.
Right, I think that might be true, yeah. So the things that we're calling privilege, I mean, this is my other problem with it. The things that we're calling white privilege are actually racism, or at least most of them. You have to name things correctly in order to come up with the right solutions. So if we keep saying white privilege over and over about things that are actually racism, we're not going to come up with the right solutions. So for example, after the Daunte Wright murder a couple of weeks ago, these memes surfaced where people were saying things like, it's a privilege to believe that the police will protect you. So the problem with that is that it's not really a privilege to believe that the police will protect you. That's their actual job.
In theory.
In theory, yeah, obviously. When they pull you over for something and then they actually, proceed to murder you, right? It's not the absence of privilege that makes that happen. That's just racism.
Yeah.
Right? And so when we're calling it privilege to say, oh, that doesn't happen to me or people in my group, right? That's really misnaming it. That's not privilege, right? What's happening to black people and brown people is racism. It has to be named correctly so that we can come up with the right solutions to that problem. So we're not actually saying that white privilege does not exist, but that it's important to distinguish between what white privilege is and what racism is. So, for example, when white people go about our lives and we don't have to think about racism, and we don't have to learn about racism. And, I've got two kids, I have two boys, I've got a white boy and a black boy. And when I can put my white boy, when I know my white boy can go out in his car, and of course I worry about him getting in an accident or all kinds of things in his car. But what I don't worry about is him getting pulled over by the police and being killed because he's black. But when my black boy goes out, even in the neighborhood, to play with his friends, there isn't a time he goes out and plays that I don't worry about something happening because he's black. Not worrying about my white boy is a form of white privilege that I have, right? And the things that could happen to my black boy, that's not about privilege or lack of privilege, that is about racism. And those are very different kinds of things.
Yeah, well, like you were saying, I think I saw this as a response, I think we all did, but people were very initially, especially white people, were very initially upset about the police murders of black people, and then they slowly tapered off, and they were like, oh, well, we're allowed to be interested, or we're allowed to care about this or not, and so that's white privilege, right? White people are using white privilege to mean racism, and therefore they erase racist actions that mostly white people are partaking in, that are taking against people of color.
Absolutely. The big things that we're trying to say here, Vidushi, is that when you misdiagnose a problem, you misdiagnose the solution. So if you're calling something white privilege that is actually racist, you're not holding white people accountable for what is really happening, and you're not encouraging them or telling them that they need to actually be part of the solution.
Yeah.
Right? You're not holding them accountable for being part of the solution.
Right.
Right? Racism is something that is active. White privilege is inactive.
Passive, yeah.
It's passive,
yeah.
Right? So white people have an obligation to stand up for racist acts. In the case of Derek Chauvin, for example, it's really obvious that in that case, the video evidence were the reason that he got convicted. If there had not been that video evidence, the case wouldn't have blown up and he wouldn't have been convicted. Now, those videos were not just taken by white people, but it's a very good example of the kind of thing that white people can do to stand up and step in for black people and other people of color. When you misidentify a problem as being white privilege and not racism, you misidentify the solution. We need to hold people accountable, white people accountable for their racism by asking white people to step in.
Thanks for watching.
Like and subscribe!